I've noticed a pattern in contemporary fantasy that a lot of well-regarded fantasy series still they feel very shallow to me, very superficial. And I call this the shallow world building problem, but the problem isn't that the writers aren't putting a lot of detail into their world building. It's that they're not thinking about how to account for that. And so I have three examples I want to talk about where I see the shallow world building problem, and three examples where the world building I think is about an equal level of shallow, but I don't think they have this problem. But before I want to talk about that, I want to talk about what it means for world building to be deep or immersive. Because obviously a lot of people consider Tolkien the gold standard for fantasy and for world building, and he was definitely one of the most meticulous, detailed world builders out there. I feel like that is not necessarily the only approach to having immersive world building. I have mentioned, I think multiple times on this channel, that my favorite fiction writer is Jack Vance. And Jack Vance had basically the opposite approach to Tolkien. Jack Vance based his stories on his lived experience traveling the world, and his stories hint at a lot of deeper underlying stuff, some of which he may have had an idea of and could develop it in future stories, but he didn't need to write it down. But there was a depth, like things that are hinted in his stories that make his worlds feel very deep and immersive to me. And so these are sort of, I feel like, two opposite approaches to what I would call deep or immersive world building. But now I want to talk about the three books, or the three series, that I have read that I feel like have this problem, and then, again, three examples where it's a similar level of depth to the world building, I feel like, but the way the writers handled it makes it not a problem. And so the first of these, which is, I love Ken Liu as a short story writer, and this series had a lot of promise. He has a lot of interesting ideas, but the shallow world building kept taking me out of the story, because he basically tried to transplant the dynastic politics of early Han Dynasty China to a fantasy world, and that didn't really translate for a number of reasons. Some of it is just the geography doesn't make sense. Like, if you know, especially early China was heavily defined by its geography, and if you look at the map in this book, you'll see this is an island with a mountain range in the center and an island chain, which is different from China, which is basically you had the Yellow River Plain, and then it was surrounded by the steppe to the north, the sea to the east, steppe to the west, and more hilly country to the south, and then jungle. And so, I mean, it wasn't just that. There were a lot of things like that just... So he has, like, 6 cultures in this entire world, for example. There were things like this that just kept taking me out of it, even though, again, I love Ken Liu. I'm interested in the history of ancient China, and I find a lot of these ideas in this book that he has, the whole silk punk thing, which is what this series is known for, really interesting. Then we have another, this time contemporary China set in the fantasy world, similar thing. This one, I finished the series and I was left disappointed. Again, some of it was a mismatch between transplanting from, and I think there's a map in here too, transplanting to a fantasy world, China, and it's very simplified. This is the China of the Second Sino-Japanese War, so up to and including World War II. And just, it doesn't feel like, for this I feel like it's one of those cases where it feels like she wanted to write a historical fiction novel. But it's, I've heard people talk about, like, a lot of fantasy writers want to write historical fiction novels. They don't want to do the research. RF Kuang definitely did the research on the historical deals, but I don't get a feel for it. There's a book that I don't have on hand, The Man Who Loved China by Simon Winchester, which is a history of Joseph Needham in China, which is an interesting story. And that gave me a much better sense of China in this period, what it was like, than all 3 books in this series. Because she got like a lot of the details, but there was no feel for it. And the world building, again, felt flat, and I kept being dragged out, and, like, this doesn't make sense. Like, I can tell it's China transplanted to the fantasy world, but it doesn't make sense to the logic of the fantasy world. So something I realized when I was editing this video yesterday is that I wasn't really explaining what I was going for very well. I was talking a lot about the geography of China not matching the fantasy worlds of the Dandelion Dynasty and the Poppy War. And I think if you don't know that, you might say, okay, well, I don't know it, so it's not going to bother me. And that's not really the point that I was trying to make. The point is that you have these two elements, the real world stuff from China and the fantasy stuff. And for both of them, they are only taking the elements that are relevant to the story directly. And that makes the story feel very shallow because there is nothing else hinted at. And so, for example, with real ancient China, you had all sorts of mythical creatures that might, in a fantasy world, they could be real too, but these are pictures from a traditional travel narrative of just animals that were mentioned along the way. So you'll see these are beautifully illustrated. And there's tons of them that were just random animals mentioned. And it doesn't even include, like, when I think of Chinese mythical creatures, I'm generally thinking about the dragon, which is in here, the phoenix, which might be in here, and then the Kirin, which is not in here, and the dragon turtle, which is also not in here. So some of the things I think of as, like, even traditional Chinese fantasy creatures aren't in here, but there's a lot that just come from this one travel narrative that make this world feel lived in, because it's a real travel narrative from what people believed were real animals. And likewise, this is from Japan, and it's similar story. So you have these pictures, but you also have the illustrations, you have stories about these animals in this book, about the cultural impact of these animals. And so that's the geography, the animals. If they didn't fit well, but there was other stuff going on, I don't think it would be as obvious that it feels like there are these two layers of fantasy and real Chinese history that are only being used to advance the story, and there's not a lot of, like, wonder pointed to elsewhere in the story that makes it feel real. And that was what I was getting to about the Needham book as well. There was just all these details that weren't really relevant to the plot, but gave me a sense of what China during the Second Sino-Japanese War was like, in a way that the Poppy War, where she was only concerned with stuff that advanced the plot, or the character development of the character too a little bit. But aside from character development of the main character and the plot, there was nothing really else from China. And the magic there basically existed just to advance the plot. And it's the same thing with the magical creatures in Ken Liu's world, is there were only two of them, I think, and they both advance the plot. And aside from that, you don't have other non-Earth creatures, which makes it really obvious they don't fit into these ecosystems, and also you only see these fantasy creatures when they advance the plot, and also the thing he does with biogeography, for example, look weird in a way that if it was more fantasy creatures that don't serve the plot, it would feel less weird, I think. So that was what I was trying to get to with those two books. And then finally, we have Naomi Novik's Temeraire. I love her books, Spinning Silver and Uprooted. I read at least one of her short stories I really liked, and I've known people who really like this. And so one thing, understand, Naomi Novik comes from fan fiction, which prioritizes character development. And so this whole thing is basically, it's character driven, like one of the characters is a dragon. And so if you don't care about world building at all, like, that works. But this is a world where dragons exist. It changes. So first of all, the interior of Africa is uninhabited, which, if you know about human history, like, humans evolved in Africa. And then just so many other things like that, and yet we still end up with, when I heard this was the Napoleonic War with dragons, and I thought it was going to be like, this Chinese Civil War set in a fantasy world. No, this is our world just with dragons, the actual Napoleonic Wars. And I just keep having issues with the world building, and then also, because I know the history of the Napoleonic Wars, and it just works the same way, there's no suspense, and I ended up, halfway through the second or third book, I ended up DNFing the series because I just couldn't get past the world building here. And again, I don't think that's the point, like, that wasn't her audience, but it's still, as I'm going to talk about in the next three books, it's still something that is avoidable. And I feel like avoidable pretty easily. And so I'm going to talk about three series where I think they use different tricks to sort of get around this without actually doing more world building. So if you're not interested in world building, it doesn't mean you have to be Tolkien. It doesn't even mean you have to be Vance. It just means you need to know what you aren't showing and account for it. And so the most interesting of these, for me, is the Joe Abercrombie First Law series. I am not a grimdark person, and most of the stuff that I hate about grimdark only comes in the second half of the third book. I think if it weren't for that, I would dislike this a lot more. But I was able to appreciate the first 2.5 books without having the issues I usually have with grimdark. And something I realized that he does is he writes from the close third-person limited perspective. And so you don't know much about what's going on with you only know what the characters know. And the characters are, even the people who are like high court officials still have very limited knowledge about the world. Even though the world is not terribly well developed, it still feels real, it feels lived in because the characters know what they need to know. And I think Abercrombie has a good sense of what the characters need to know to make the world feel lived in, or at least he did with this series. And this is another thing about Joe Abercrombie that's interesting is I showed you the maps for 2 of these books in these fantasy worlds, and trying to transplant China onto a geography that didn't match and made a lot of the stuff not make sense to me. Joe Abercrombie, there is a map of this world that he uses for his own reference, but he doesn't allow it to be in the books. Although this edition, I think, has it like loosely on the cover, but he doesn't allow it to be in the books because it takes people out of the reading, he thinks, to keep looking at the map, which is an interesting choice that I think actually makes sense, even though I ended up looking up the map on my phone when I was reading these books. And it's sort of the opposite of, I don't have this one with me, but Stranger in Olandria. That was a book that I think would have worked really well, except that she had a friend make the map, and the map did not match the geography as she described it. And so that just kept taking me out of it, like trying to reconcile that. And then we have, so this one, City of Brass, she's writing it in a very simplified world. There's really only like 6 or 7 groups of the genies, the jinns, who they're loosely based on like a simplified version of human culture. But it's an overlay on our world, and the jinns, they're long-lived, and they're not human. And so it makes sense that this world might be simpler, but there's still stuff going on in the background in the human world that isn't really relevant to the story, that reminds us this is just an overlay on the overall our world. And so it makes, to me at least, it makes this world not really feel shallow in the same way as the first 3 books I mentioned, because it's an overlay, it's contrasted, and I'm like, oh, there's a reason the jinns, they're long-lived, they're not human, they don't necessarily think like humans, and this might be why their culture is simpler, especially with the longevity aspect of it. That would tend to breed cultural conservatism and less variation. And then finally we have Fonda Lee, the Green Bone Saga. And so this one is interesting because she sets it on basically a fantasy version of Taiwan. And the fantasy Taiwan is really well developed, and the rest of the world is not. The rest of the world is not developed at all. And there are a few hints, like with the map, where I'm like, this doesn't seem like it makes sense when she transposes stuff from our geography. But for the most part, I was, even in the second and third book, I was still in the series. Or it was only been the third book that was, you saw the outside world, because you see it mostly through the perspective of immigrants, these fantasy Taiwan immigrants living in these countries, who are in their, first-generation immigrants in insular communities. And so similar to with Joe Abercrombie with the Blade itself, you expect them to have a limited sort of view and understanding of the outside world. And so I think this one, there was one time where there was something that was based on a real Cold War incident, and I was like, the geography doesn't make it make sense here, but aside from that, that was the only time I was taken out. So overall, this was immersive. And so these 3 books, series, First Law, Daevabad, and the Green Bone Saga, I feel like all handled the limitations in different ways. They didn't try to build worlds that were particularly more complex than the worlds of the first 3 books I brought up. In fact, Ken Liu in The Grace of Kings does, I would say, at least as much world building as some of these other writers. The problem is he doesn't handle what he hasn't built in a way that as a reader, I feel like, oh, there's a reason for it, and so it takes me out. Anyways, obviously, writers write for different reasons, and readers read for different reasons. As I said, with Naomi Novik, for example, she comes from fan fiction. Fan fiction people, they're looking for the characters, they're much less interested in the world building. And so for the audience, this may be fine, although it also limits her audience, possibly unnecessarily. The point of this video is I feel like you don't have to be like, again, Jack Vance, having a lot of experience in the world and like hinting at a lot of stuff that isn't seen. And you definitely don't have to be like Tolkien doing tons of detailed notes. You don't need an immersive world with a lot of details hinted at. You just need a reason that these details aren't there or aren't hinted at in the story. And so I just wanted to talk about that briefly. That's something I've noticed and I've thought about a little bit. I'm Magpie. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next one.